Check 1 2 3. Check check check. Test 1 2 3 4 5. Testing. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 3 4 5. One two three check. 1 2 1 2. Check check 1 2 1 2. One two check 1 2. 1 2 3 check 1 2 1 2 check. Check 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 1 2 test. 1 2 3 4 5 test. Check 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 check 1 2 1 2. 1 2 3 check 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 4 5. Check 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Testing 1 2 3. Check 1 2 3 4. Test 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing 1 2 3. Check check check. Test test. 1 2 3 4 5. Testing 1 2. One, two, three, check 1 2, check, check, check. Test 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 3. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 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 1 2. Testing 1 2 3 4 5. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Testing 1 2 3. Check 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 1 2. Test 1 2. Check 1 2. 1 2 3 4 5. Check 1 2 1 2.
Good evening, everyone. First thing I'm going to say is, well, welcome. Second thing I'm going to say is that I've been reminded by the clerk to remind all of you who are sitting up at the table here to speak directly into your mic, but otherwise don't pick them up or adjust them or any of that stuff. Just kind of leave them where they are and speak directly into them so that hopefully we can all be heard. All right. So today is June 15th, 2023. The third thing I'll mention is that Randy, as you may have noticed, is joining us virtually today. And hoping that Randy is feeling better. Glad you could be with us, Randy. Because this is a work session and we won't be taking formal action or voting on anything, Randy's presence virtually doesn't, we don't have to worry about quorum issues with Randy, and we won't be voting, so Randy won't need to worry about voting on anything. So that wouldn't normally be allowed under these circumstances. So as I mentioned, tonight's council meeting is a work session. As usual in work sessions, the council does not take formal action or receive public comment. Purpose of work sessions is to give us time for conversation amongst ourselves about a specific issue and ultimately to provide guidance to the town manager. Purpose of tonight's work session is to discuss options for a concept plan for the currently unused portion of Westwood Cemetery, as well as some related information that the manager has prepared in response to questions from the council. This information is all included in our packets for tonight, and we can certainly ask questions about that this evening. So I believe we'll receive a brief presentation from staff and then talk about how we'd like to proceed. We've received a lot of input on this topic from community members coming from a range of perspectives. I think as a goal for us tonight, as we work toward a consensus, it would be good to provide as much clear guidance for the manager as we possibly can so that he understands the direction we wish to go in and understands the outcome we're looking for and can plan accordingly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the manager and receive the staff presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. I believe Trish McGuire, our Plan Director, will get us started.
Good evening. Ben Schmadeke and from Public Works and I, Trish McGuire from the Planning Department, are going to make a brief presentation. We have about 14 slides to share with you tonight. You are screen sharing. Oh, wait, didn't change the view. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here tonight. So we're going to walk through a little bit of background information and other information about the about the Westwood Cemetery. It's located right down the street from here. As was noted, this is an opportunity for you to focus on some information about the cemetery, and what we have prepared for you is some background information as well as information about the current plot availability at the Westwood Cemetery, an overview of land where cemeteries are permissible in the vicinity of Carrboro, some examination of land that we've done in the Planning Department of parcel and other information that we have in our GIS system, the concept plan that was prepared in 2020 for the town to consider additional cemetery, an additional cemetery plan on the property, some estimated development costs, and the regulations that are posted at the property now. That is to say the ordinance that applies to the activities that are, as they're defined to be, occur on the property. I'll jump in. A little bit of background. This property was established as a town cemetery in 1948. We do have the earliest burial noted there as recorded in recording a date of 1903, and that is not something we have researched in a detailed way to be able to explain further, but it is something we want to be sure and share. There are 2,162 lots that are unobstructed that are platted on these properties, and they are platted in zones 1, 2, and 3 as shown here. on the left side of the aerial photograph. There are no plots available in Zone 1 for sale. There are none in Zone 2, and there are currently, as of today or yesterday, 76 available in Zone 3. Zone 4 does not have any burial plots platted within it. So currently, the fees that apply to purchasers of these burial plots are $750 if the plot is to be used for a resident, and $1,500 if it's for a non-resident. The property, the cemetery was segregated until the late 1960s, so it was only white persons were allowed to be buried there until that time. Green burials are not allowed in the Westwood Cemetery per the town's action a few years ago to allow green burials in the old cemetery, old Carrboro Cemetery. This was not extended to this location. It is possible to put up to 4 individuals who have been cremated into one burial plot at Westwood. And just a little background too, this year for Creek Week, Public Works staff cleaned up the wooded buffer, which is really a lovely piece of this property, in March, and removed a whole bunch of trash. So pretty phenomenal. 1,330 pounds. In terms of other lands for cemetery use, as I said, we did a high-level examination of basically parcels of land in southern Orange County using our GIS. We looked for vacant or pretty much vacant properties that were at least 6 acres in size, so a little bit bigger than the areas that are shown as open on the current Westwood Cemetery, and we picked those properties if they were within a 3-mile buffer of our jurisdiction at present. We removed parcels that were identified as private open space within subdivisions that had already been established. We removed properties that were significantly impacted by floodplains and stream buffers. We examined soil information, not in a very detailed way, but to see if there were any major flags related to bedrock, etc. And we also did an analysis of proximity of parcels to arterial or collector type streets. So we didn't want to create long driveways back to properties that would be difficult to access if someone were to consider developing a cemetery, for example. There may have been 1 or 2 other features, but we did an analysis that was a remote sensing type of analysis on GIS data. And we also did prepare some estimated development costs. We have information for you about the ranges of costs of these parcels. This was shared, I guess, what went out to you yesterday or the day before. Oh, I know. One of the other big things was we checked to see where cemeteries were permissible as a land use. So from a zoning perspective, we did remove properties that did not have cemeteries as a permissible use. So we did identify 122 parcels of land, and they range in size from, they had to be at least 6 acres, but they range in size from just over 6 acres up to, as you can see, about 155 acres of land. So we did not, segment out, and this is a high-level analysis. But we've provided the ranges of values, median and average values, as well as the deviation. You can see it's fairly significant, partly because the properties some of them are pretty widely different in terms of size and other characteristics. There's an average cost per acre provided as well. Many of these properties, the majority of them are in Orange County, so Orange County's jurisdiction captures pretty much all of these dots on this side of the map. Here, there are a few within our jurisdiction, one of which is the town's property up on Old NC 86, and then a couple down here near Damascus Church Road, and then the others are in Chapel Hill's jurisdiction over here. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ben. If he has any, he can go run through his information, and we'll be available for questions. Thanks.
Good evening. So Public Works manages the cemeteries in that we maintain the grounds, sell the plots, and work with the funeral homes. And so in 2018, as Zone 3 was starting to dwindle, we hired a consultant to look at Zone 4 for subsurface rock and just do a feasibility of cemetery development. And so the rock exploration was the first step. This exhibit here it's a topographic map of rock locations, the outcrops, which you can see are these two black stars. And then this first line is 2 feet. So at 2 feet down, you hit partially weathered rock, 4 feet. And our current traditional burial depth is 6 feet. A national standard is 5 feet. So this would basically tell us where cemetery or traditional burials can happen. And ultimately, this is what the consultant provided for a concept plan. We'll get more into it, but the focus was to design around the rock conflicts, which, if you recall, we're kind of at the intersection of the road. Keep some open space, establish some walking trails, include more memorial park amenities, including benches, flagpoles, and hardscape. This would improve a site stormwater runoff with the rain garden in the bottom left. Runoff has been a kind of an ongoing maintenance issue. Dedicated space for green burials. As Trish mentioned, the town did allow green burials in the old Carrboro Cemetery beginning in 2018, but those quickly sold out. And just overall, this diversifies the interment options, including all of the options for cremains. And this concept plan has capacity as shown. A4 and A5 are the traditional burials, 328. B1 would be in-ground cremains. The C blocks would be columbarium walls. And then F1 will be the natural burials. And so again, this just gets into the kind of key features here. Conventional, traditional burials, in-ground cremains here. The columbarium walls in orange. D would be a reflection area with seating, flags, an ossuary if desired, or a memorial wall. E could be a scattering garden. F are your dedicated natural burial areas. This does reconfigure the road via loop road and asphalt and natural surface walking trails. Oops. So we used some of the estimates that the consultant provided in 2020 and just took a phased approach. So if this was decided to move forward, we would want to first do the loop road. And so that would be phase 1, which would allow for opening up both the in-ground cremains and traditional and natural burials. And so again, the cost here is just the installation of the loop road, demolition of the existing cul-de-sac, and the surveying and plotting required to map out those 3 areas. And then to do the full implementation, there's quite a bit of work to do that. Again, some design services, landscaping, purchasing of flagpoles, benches, the columbarium walls, and the installation of the walking paths. And using the capacity figure that I showed earlier, the estimated total revenue would be $2.5 million. And then I did note estimated annual maintenance. So this would be an increase in the maintenance over what we are currently doing. And again, just the phase one would not increase maintenance. The full phase two implementation would slightly. And then using some of the acreage costs that we found to do a basic minimum development for a new cemetery, we would recommend $1 million budget for land acquisition, and this just assumes a 1,000-foot paved access road, the surveying and plotting just to map out traditional burials, some basic landscaping, and the permitting and regulatory costs. And so this assumes about 3 miles outside of town, we just put an estimated annual maintenance figure of $12,000. And using 2,000 traditional plots, assuming 75% resident purchase rate, the expected revenue would be $1.8 million. And then this is the ordinance, the regulatory sign that's posted at the cemetery. We did look at other towns. A lot of towns do try and promote walking and jogging around cemetery roads. A lot of them do try and keep dogs and pets out. But I believe in the answers to those questions, we included some information on that. That's it for tonight for us. We do have some of the slides from the previous work session if those questions come up.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So looking at the concept plan for the site, to what extent is that sort of a scaled back version of what we've talked about, what was presented before?
Yeah, let me pull up the big. So this is, all they did was scale it back. The loop road was always there. The rock does limit some of the traditional burial area, but the full-blown plan included more in-ground cremains here, more dedicated green burials in the woods here around the walking trails, and then this area would be conventional or traditional burial plots.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And the last thing I'll note here, this does include smaller plots, 4x12 plots. I believe our current plots are 6x14.
Great. All right. Thanks both Trish and Ben. You're available for questions if we have any. I know. Thank you. Want to appreciate all the work that staff has done to put this information together and responding to some questions that have come up over the course of many months of thinking through this issue. So, Richard, thanks for that. I feel like, I want to make sure that council members have an opportunity to ask any questions they have about the information either in the packet or what we've heard here this evening. And I'm also kind of trying to keep my eye on the screen where Randy is or is not located right now. But Wesley is going to let me know if he sees Randy's hand go up so that I can
there she is.
so that I can call on her. So Wesley, if you'll just kind of help me keep an eye on that. It's a little harder for me to see that from here. I think in my mind, a sort of one central question for us to sort of just deal with is we have this this very much scaled back concept plan from the staff based on the original consultant's design. And I would just be interested in, which I think offers a sort of way to think about the site in terms of meeting both the interest in additional space for burials, as well as interest we've heard in maintaining green space on the property. So I guess I would just be interested in hearing from council members reactions to the concept that we've seen, and then of course, any other questions you have for staff about that, but I just would like to make sure, that seems like the kind of central question here before us in some ways, right, is what do we think, what's the reaction to this concept? So Barbara and then Sammy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff, for the presentation. Before I give my comments, I had some other comments that I wanted to say. And the first thing is that everybody's voice matters. I hope that we can come back together as a community. This process has felt very divisive as community came in to give public comment. Emotions ran high, things were said and done as the advocacy work continued. I simply ask that everyone respect this work session and any subsequent decision. This has been hard for council members and everybody else. It's been very difficult. Any thoughts of hurting or intimidating people because you don't agree with the decision would not be useful in bringing our community back together. It would have the opposite effect. I am not just a council member, I am a human being. My own heart has quivered at times, and I'm sure that others' hearts have too. So let's be kind and understanding as this process moves forward. Thank you, and I really felt like I needed to say that. This has been very difficult for everybody that has come into this space, everybody. As far as the, I'm sorry, I did not mean to get that emotional, but I just feel like folks have absorbed a lot with this whole issue, and I don't feel like I need to stuff that down. So I had to have this point of privilege to be able to express how I felt about how all this has been going down. So I thank you for listening. So my first question is, it's more of a comment. I'm trying to remember back to when the consultant did come, and I also feel like I remember that council members were not interested in the complete build-out. Maybe a phase-in. This is supposed to be scaled down from that. Is that what this is scaled down? And so then I have some questions, I guess, about the columbariums and the scattering plots. I also wanted to bring into the conversation fencing. And I think the fencing, along with our ordinance, will help protect the sanctity of the space that is the cemetery. I know a lot of municipalities do fence in their cemeteries, and so it does send somewhat of a signal. I know Old Carrboro Cemetery is fenced in, so I just kind of wanted to throw that out. But I also want more information on the columbariums and the scattering plots. Like, I feel like maybe we may not have to do as many columbariums, and also trying to understand how the scattering plots work, because it may be that we're going to scale back even more than what has been presented here tonight with some of it. The scattering plots in particular, I'm just like, well, what is that, and how does that work? Does anybody, staff, would know that answer?
Would Ben be the best person to talk through some of the details of the concept plan?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Welcome back, Ben. I do think, Barbara, you're right, that when this first was presented that when the full plan was first presented, I think that the conversation on the council at that time, and this was, a few years ago, was that there wasn't a strong interest in the full build out. I think that's right.
So the scattering plot was essentially a garden, and the way I recall it being explained to me is it would go with a memorial wall, or typically they go with a memorial wall, so you can have a plaque mounted on the wall and then scatter cremains in the garden, and then rain would just wash it away. It would be big enough to where it could
Okay, and I guess any concern about the scattering, because the cemetery, of course, is surrounded by community and neighborhoods and things. I didn't know if it was contained somehow, or,
They're large gardens, so I would imagine there would be some considerations for maintaining that space and ensuring that it doesn't get out of control. But they are, from what I understand, fairly common in cemeteries.
okay.
And maybe you don't do the whole scattering of the cremains.
Yeah, because I know I'm interested in the in-ground continuing, as well as the green burial, and some way with the cremains. But that's where it gets sketchy, because I'm just like, what do we really want for cremains? And I'm feeling like not something with like a really huge footprint, but something for the cremains, if that makes sense. Because I know that, the structures and stuff, like this one, for example, I mean, I consider that a big footprint. And so, just in thinking about the cremains, I like the idea of scattering plot or garden, but just being very conscious that, the cemetery sits in the midst of, neighborhoods. And then about the fence. So I just,
fencing,
I wanted to
right.
throw all that out. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Barbara. Next, I have Sammy, and then Susan, and Randy. I do see your hand, Randy, so you will be after Susan. Sammy.
Yeah, I was hoping to get a little context also, because one of the things we're assessing here is this is a vacant part of the cemetery, and there has been questions. Part of the big question that we're trying to resolve is how to best use this. Continue expansion of the cemetery or use something else. And the thing that's come to the fore is a park. And for that reason, I'd like staff, if you have information in the comprehensive plan, from the comprehensive plan, on what, for this area of town, the comprehensive plan speaks about the need for parks. And I know this is a qualified census area that would be served by such a park. If you could speak a bit about that, both for parks, but also cemeteries. And I know that they both are related in the comprehensive plan, in large part because we, as a council, have never resolved this issue, which is why we're here tonight. But if you could give us some of that
On the
context,
website.
I would appreciate it.
I didn't open it. Oh, here we go. Here I am, right there. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Here first and get over to that web page. Sure, let's see. Give me. Okay, yeah, so this is, I pulled up here, thank you for the question. I pulled up Chapter 8 from the comp plan, which is the Recreation, Parks, and Cultural Resources chapter. And just as a big, and our Rec and Parks Director is here tonight as well, J.G. Ferguson, and so, and may want to dig more deeply into this question. But the plan does include several goals related to recreation and parks. As with all things in Carrboro, we start with recreation first, and then we park. So our programming is the first goal, inclusive programming for all of our interest groups, activities based on One Orange, et cetera. A second goal is related to access, and there are a number of strategies associated with that goal. The next one is associated with access to have all people in Carrboro, ensuring that they all have access to safe, equitable, and connected, they all have safe, equitable, and connected access to parks, open space, and recreational facilities. Strategy 2.1 is striving for a park, green, playfield, or other green space within walking distance, a half-mile or 10-minute walk, and physically accessible to all residents in Carrboro. As part of the conceptualization and operationalization of this concept during the development of the plan. Some mapping was done of facilities in the town, and the plan itself includes what's called a park access map. The map shows in purple those portions of the community that are within a 10-minute walk, a measurement that was done with GIS here, of a town park. Other areas are shown in this lighter shade, sort of blue, walking access to another type of park-type facility. I call it quasi-public. And there are some overlaps here. You can see places where there's some overlap. There's a lot of the town, actually, not just the area near the Westwood Cemetery, that is not within 10-minute walk of an area. And the planning that was done in 1994, the town's first master plan for recreation and parks, actually identified a park in the northern area, very similar to the vicinity of where Twin Creeks Park is planned, and I mean the land's been purchased and some planning done. A park around where Dr. Martin Luther King Park is located, and actually a park further to the south to serve the southern portion of our jurisdiction. So you can see we've got some areas that are, and one of the things that the plan does is there's an extensive, I shouldn't say too extensive, but a fairly extensive description of this concept and what this map was trying to achieve in terms of illustrating some interests. Its description points out that this is just a tool that was done for the purposes of sort of illustrating this concept, but that really much more analysis of this question needs to be done in conjunction with the other aspects of the town's goal. If you look at the plan, there are some criteria about future parks planning that have not been articulated. There are specific needs that may be more carefully identified when we really map both the public parks as well as the private spaces that our recreation and active recreation facilities and open space requirements through development have put in place around town. So this map does include some of that. It does include where open space has been mapped, that's been set aside as in a neighborhood. But there are apartment complexes, for example, where there's not a dedicated parcel of land called open space, but there has been open space set aside as well. And this map doesn't illustrate that. So I think for the most part, it speaks to the fact that there is a much more detailed evaluation of this question that's needed to be able to determine where the town may wish to prioritize development of a new park. And I'm speaking for you back there, JG. I don't know if you want to say anything else, but that's, I think, what the plan says
Great,
on this
thank
point.
you for that.
And if I might say one other
Sure.
thing, there is another chapter, of course, that speaks to this location, and that is the land use chapter of the plan. So in chapter 9, the town includes, the plan includes in chapter 9 land use recommendations for corridor plans in our community, and the Jones Ferry Road corridor and the downtown opportunities description in the opportunity map encompasses the area where the Westwood Cemetery is located. It includes this language: proceed with the Westwood Cemetery planning process in a way that considers needs and interests of residents for interment, open space, and other potential uses. This is and I didn't point to I'll go back actually, because there is a statement on that park access page that I should share for everyone to see, because I've skimmed over it. But anyway, it does say, utilize town-owned land for permanent open space or expansion of the cemetery. So the plan process recognized that there were differing opinions and interests that were being expressed, and I think it simply is a record of that communication that was shared in the process. And I'll just jump over here. Hopefully Randy can see that. If you go down here, you'll see that the plan specifically says, this is the note that was included through the Carrboro Connects engagement process. There have been calls for converting the undeveloped portion of the cemetery into a park. Others wish to respect the historic legacy of the cemetery and allow its use to expand. This is an ongoing community issue.
Great, thank
Obviously,
you
to be
so much.
explored further.
And I think that captures, it says it right there, that's why we're here tonight, we're trying to resolve that. But I think the other aspect of this is that in our defining where parks should be, there's a lot of unknowns that still have to be looked at and researched, including how to weigh or not homeowner association, open space. And for this reason, because it's so unresolved, I still think that it is important, given that there aren't any other green spaces of this size that would serve this part of town, as is shown in the map. There are no parks that are served within a 10-minute walking distance. My interest is making sure that we don't close the door on the possibility of this potentially being a park. If that process of identifying and defining what a park is shows that it requires a bigger space, it would be a shame if we close that door tonight, which is the reason why I thought, and we all considered, but it wasn't accepted by the body as a council, that we could slow down the rate at which plots are being bought up in the cemetery so as to buy some time. Given that's not an option, I could be supportive of a smaller amount of land dedicated for cemetery use expansion, with the understanding that we would leave open the door for assessing what it means to have a park within a 10-minute radius. And from my perspective, that would leave open the door for the possibility of having a place in their downtown that could serve that purpose. The value of assessing cemeteries outside of town, I think it behooves us to be prepared if the assessment of what a park within 10 minutes is shows that it would be appropriate to use a large space and that this is the space. We will set ourselves up to respect the ritual that is surrounding death and have a continuation of a space within which to do that in a setting that is more peaceful. As towns grow, they encompass things that used to be rural. My grandmother in Columbia is in a columbarium, lives. She passed away many years ago, but she's in a columbarium, and the cemetery where she is surrounded by a city. So they, to keep the peace, put walls up, and it's just the nature of how urbanism takes space up and why so often cemeteries originally were in nice, bucolic places. And so I think for generations down the road, unless we're wanting to get out of the business of cemeteries, which I personally am not, because I believe in the ritual of that surrounds death and honoring those who've passed away. I think that is the value of really taking seriously this opportunity to consider purchasing land outside of town. In the analysis staff shared, what isn't accounted for in those costs is the cost of a park space in the downtown. So in my view, like if we were to accurately make that cost-benefit analysis, we would be subtracting, if we were to fully or use a larger portion of the cemetery expansion, we would need to subtract or actually add on to the cost of the cemetery, the cost of what it would be to acquire a land, even just in the outskirts of town. Staff assessed per acre within Carrboro $61,000, but in town per acre anywhere from 10 to 115 times that cost. So just to illustrate like the value and the opportunity cost in terms of expanding further into this area, what it represents in terms of not being able to fulfill this comprehensive plan goal of making sure that parks are within access of a 10-minute walk. So that's my perspective on this. And lastly, I just want to echo what Barbara was saying. You know, this has been a very difficult conversation. There are different perspectives that we all bring to the table in terms of what we hold valuable in this conversation. And I too would hope that we could hold this conversation respectful. But I also want to express gratitude to everyone who's come out and share their perspective, because you make it hard for us. That's what we have to balance, you know. And here we are tonight. So whichever way any of us and all of us fall, I hope that everyone can understand that we're doing our best in making a decision here tonight.
Thank you, Sammy.
Thanks, Sammy. Next up, I have Susan, then Randy, and I saw Eleazar's hand.
I'll get in there. Thank you, Sammy, and thank you, Barbara, both for your comments. I very much agree with both the comments that you both made. I think about these last few weeks and a lot of community members have come and spoken before us and shared lots of different values and priorities around everything from, religion and culture to land use to, how we plan to use the space going forward, recreational space. And so here we are now trying to balance all of these different things, which is very challenging. And I actually think the concept plan does a good job with it. I think it does a very good job with it. And I say that because for me, at the end of the day, this is a cemetery. And I see it as a cemetery with also space adjoining that is space really intended as space to memorialize those who have passed, space for quiet reflection, quiet space for light recreation. But Sammy, to your point about a park, I associate parks with basketball courts and with playgrounds and with flag football and soccer games. And I don't find that to be fitting with Westwood Cemetery. So I would not be able to support a park, although I would very much be able to support the open space that's being provided. I did want to also, that's just a question for staff, maybe at another time, but I think about Town Commons, and I know it's not technically a park, but there is a playground there. There is open space there, and I don't know where that goes in terms of fitting the technical definition of a park, but it's a very close walk for some of the neighbors, so I just wanted to add that to the conversation. One thing that's very important to me, and Barbara touched on this as well, is I feel like there needs to be maybe a little bit more separation between the cemetery and the open space with some kind of buffer, maybe removing the pear trees. I think they need replacing anyway, and adding other trees, vegetation. Randy may speak to this because we talked about it earlier today, but this would also include, I'm curious if even some kind of sound barrier could be provided in that space to really separate these two uses of the land. I did have some questions about the space for the in-ground burials. And so my guess is that since it looks like the burials are going to, there's enough plots for about 10 years out, I'm guessing that means there would be about 660 burials added here, plots added here was my guess. And I'm curious if that's because there was a lot of rock in the other parts of Zone 4, so those couldn't be turned into plots, or if there were other reasons that we were only adding 660. So that's one question I had.
Ben, would you mind coming back up and helping Susan with that?
Stay up here.
Yeah.
You can use
We
those.
should just have you at the table with us.
Yeah, there's some comfy chairs over there.
Well, I'll start with the rock exhibit. Again, this does kind of dictate design. If if you can kind of overlay the concept plan on this, the green burial is in this kind of -4 foot topographic area, and the green burial is 3.5 feet deep. -6, this it's around here. Again, anything 5 feet or less would support a traditional burial. And the original fully developed concept plan did include traditional burials in this area. However, there would be some rock excavation that would be expected with that. And so for this concept, this basically takes advantage of the existing, the existing soils, and again, the capacity for conventional graves, which is the 4x12 burial plot at 5-foot depth, is 328. That's A4 and A5. B1 is a in-ground plot for remains. Let's see if it has a depth. Well, it's a 4x4 plot at 2 feet deep. And that is where you would get 568. Again, the more expanded plan did have a B2 section, oops, in this area. And so ultimately the site isn't that great for traditional burials, so options for cremain interment was really what was driving this.
Ben, one follow-up to that question. When you say the site wasn't that great, so you're referring to all of the open space?
The rock.
Because of the rock.
Right.
And so would it be fair to say that outside of the plots that we would be adding under this plan, there's really not too many more plots to be added?
There could be, I would say no to traditional plots. If there was desire to expand into this space, you would have to probably do some rock excavation. As you can see here, you would want to be mostly outside of this 4-foot line, somewhere around in this vicinity. So you could, it would support some traditional burials in this general area without rock excavation.
That's going towards Fidelity?
This is Fidelity. Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one question I will throw out that we can consider later is if it turns out, it sounds like there's not too many more opportunities to do the traditional burials, I think maybe we consider keeping this open space in perpetuity, since there may not be too many more opportunities to expand with the burials anyway. Another thing, Ben, I wanted to ask you is, are there any areas closer to the residential edge that could be used in terms of future plots?
On Davy Road?
No.
On this backside?
Yes, exactly. Kind of like going down the slope a little bit. I don't know how the soil would be, if that's even an opportunity.
Yeah,
I know it would mean taking out some of the trees.
Yeah, we've never looked at disturbing the buffer, and I'm not sure what property setbacks would be required. And that's why in the one version it did have more green burials in this section here, because that would allow for keeping most of the trees. But overall, we wanted to keep the wooded buffer when this was being developed.
Mm-hmm. One question, Ben, on the columbarium. My understanding is town of Chapel Hill has a columbarium, and is that open to Carrboro residents?
Yes, they sell to non-residents. So when we did our market analysis, Chapel Hill ran out of plots in 2017, and I think due to demand, they installed the columbariums. And they have a flat fee of $1,000 for resident and non-resident.
Okay. So I just wanted to point out here that when Chapel Hill went out of the cemetery business, some of their residents have been using burial plots at Westwood. And so maybe this is an opportunity for Carrboro residents to be using the columbarium at Chapel Hill. I'll throw that out, something to consider. And finally, I just wanted to mention, to Barbara's point about the fence, I would also be in favor of that. I think it's a really nice way to sort of sanctify this space, to make really clear what the use for the space is, providing that separation. So I would be in favor of that too. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Susan. Just hang tight, Ben, in case there are more questions, if you don't mind. Randy, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I want to thank you all for allowing me to participate remotely. This is what being boosted looks like. I have to know.
She's an advertiser of Booster.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just back up and say thank you to the community. All the folks who attended all the meetings and came out really informed my thinking, helped to shape what I began to see very clearly as a community way forward. And I really appreciate that, because I think that in these vastly polarizing times, it's important to recognize the importance of folks coming together and moving forward as community. And I think Barbara suggested that in her remarks. A couple of things. Thank you, Barbara, for bringing up the consultant's report, because I want to put it out there that the consultants are in the cemetery business. And that report, one of the things that guiled me about it when they presented it, is Carrboro was asking for how we could maximize plots, not how we were going to create this expansive cemetery. And the community informed my thinking in that community is asking for conventional burials. They're not asking for columbariums. They're not asking anything specific about cremains. And Ben, I do have one question about that. And they're definitely not asking anything about scattering plots and gardens to scatter and scattering cremains. Now that's very important, because part of the tradition that we're trying to uphold with the Westwood Cemetery is the internments, the traditional internments. I'd like to see us add the green burials, because we did in the old Chapel Hill Cemetery, and it is consistent with our climate action goals. So I'm going to say that. Scattering ashes is not consistent with our climate goals. It's not consistent with being adjacent to a neighborhood. So I'm going to put that out there. But I want to be particularly aware of the fact that we were presented with a development plan. And I didn't think then, and I don't think now, that that's what we're interested in. So to underscore what has been said that I agree with, the number one, the community's interest in the preservation of traditional conventional internments and the potential inclusion of the green burial sites. Fencing. Thank you, Susan, for mentioning that, and Barbara also. With fencing, there are very few cemeteries that I have ever known, especially as areas become more dense, that do not have stately looking fences. It shocked me 46 years ago. It still shocks me that the sidewalk is within feet of a headstone, and that there's no barrier that protects those graves. You know, I know people who are buried within the first few rows, and it boggles my mind that if they have a long leash for their dog could be defecating on a cemetery plot. So I see, and I'm putting this out there, I know I'm getting into the weeds ahead of myself, but since fencing was mentioned, let me tell you what I envision as community was speaking, that we create a really a stately, almost majestic kind of a wrought iron fence around the perimeter of the cemetery, with a gate at the roadway to the turnaround. Why? Because the gate says when you walk through here, when you go through here, you are in a very dignified space. And I'm not saying that it's a gate that's locked. I'm just saying that it shows that there is a formal entrance that is dignified and shows the stateliness of the grounds. I also think that I don't want to get ahead of myself, but if Ben, if you could put up the slide with the rock, the topography that shows the contours. And the reason that that's important is because there's a tree line there. Can you, yeah, is there a way to make that larger? There's a tree line from Fidelity to the tightest part of contour. Can you kind of show folks for me, because I can't. So from Fidelity, okay, there we go. All right, get the cursor up towards Fidelity and drag it down that little tree line. Nope, the tree line going in on the road. On the, that's it, right there, slow. Okay, there you go. And so that tree line, I know there's Bradford pears, there's, you know, there's species of trees that can possibly be replaced with native species. But my point is that the fence could potentially go at the back of a vegetation line and could have a sound wall behind it, which would insulate the sound that is in the cemetery. And it also would prevent any sound that would come from any open space from going into the cemetery. The question, I think the turnaround could be rerouted, just as I think Ben says, so that the instead of where it is now, so if you drag your cursor down, Ben, to where the turnaround is, the next really viable property for the burial of the depth that we're looking for is really, take your cursor going east. Am I correct? Yeah, in that area, you know, yeah, no, go higher. Okay, so my point, did I say something funny?
No.
Okay. So my point is that there's a way to accommodate this so that the fencing is delineating and it's creating the kind of barrier we need. A sound barrier would ensure that there's dignity and a sense of restfulness in the open space, that the open space, just like the cemetery, could have benches. I mean, there's ways to convey that a space is meant to be, you know, a spiritual and a resting place on both sides of it. But if you had vegetation on both sides of the fence and you had the sound wall, you'd be able to create the kind of atmosphere that I think all the community folks who spoke on both sides could see the value in. Lastly, I want to say that, you know, as far as the essential question, we haven't dealt with the essential question. I don't know at what point, it's not tonight, that we deal with the essential question, which is, does Carrboro intend to remain in the cemetery business? Because if we expand, we may get 10 years. So that just puts off decision-making to a future council, which is exactly what was done to us. And I say that because one of the things that's important here is that we understand that if we're going to stay in the cemetery business, there's going to be ongoing costs. And I was particularly taken with the fact that Orange County, Chapel Hill, Hillsborough, they're not interested in partnering, which means, are we willing to take on being the cemetery for the county or beyond? And that's a question I think we need to at least grapple with. And I'm going to say this because this is important, that this council probably knows more about this issue than any future council coming up. And so I would like the question of whether or not we would like to continue to be in the cemetery business to be taken up by this council and not a future council in 2024, since this is the body that has done the deep dive on the community and on the question of the cemetery as a business in Carrboro. Lastly, yes, I agree that if we have open space, it should be in perpetuity. Why? Because the graves are in perpetuity. If the graves are in perpetuity, if they're considered that way, then the space adjoining it needs to be protected and preserved in the same way. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Next up, hear from some thoughts from Eleazar.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you all of my colleagues who have already spoken on this issue, and I will echo my gratitude for community who's come out on this issue. Before I go into my questions, I just want to make some opening comments, and I'm going to try to be control my emotions when I do this. Well, for folks to understand me, I might have to. As some of you may know, while we were going through this process, I had to travel to bury my own father, right? So sitting through this conversation has been uniquely difficult in the fact that my brother and I had to figure out this process, which I wish on no one, on a moment's notice, and realizing that making long story short, based on availability and based on what we could do, it put a significant financial burden on my brother and I. Right. And why do I say this, right? So my first thought when I was looking at this question is why does Carrboro need to be in this cemetery business? And going back to Councilmember Haven O'Donnell's remark, that is the fundamental question. And at the moment, I don't know if I can. I don't know where I stand on that. But when I'm looking at Westwood Cemetery, I see it as Westwood Cemetery. I see it as a place where folks will have to make the hard decision of. Well, it's not a decision really, because you have to do it of laying their loved ones, their family members to rest. And I'm not gonna sit here and say that, the decision that I had to make was extremely hard, because it wasn't. We had to do it. We had to look at our options, and based on those options, we did what we could, and I don't want folks in Carrboro to have to go through that heavy expense, knowing of that the cemetery is here in Carrboro. When I look at it, I don't see a park. I can't bring myself to see a park. I don't see a space where I want to have animals, pets. I have pets. I love my pets. I would never bring a pet into a cemetery. Couple of things. Moving into my questions. First, can I see the paper, please?
Which one?
So I just want to put this on the record around the question about perpetuity. Mr. Attorney, this question has become before us, right? So can you kind of respond to this question of, can we delegate this open space in perpetuity? Is that within our legal ability?
Well, the answer is yes, but there's a limitation on it.
Could you use the mic, please, Nick? Thank you.
Yeah, the answer is yes. There is a practical limitation, though, that nothing would prohibit a future council from changing their minds about that. That being said, any future council that was considering changing what had been decided before presumably would be very sensitive to what had been originally decided. And in addition, over the passage of time, citizens begin to rely upon the decision that was made. You know what I mean? It affects the kind of constituencies. And then the final point is an obvious one. Over time, things change, and people's interests change. So that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Mr. Attorney, because that was kind of what I wanted to make sure that we all understood, that I think I'm in favor of the plan as it stands right now. I do have questions around the spreading of people's remains in these gardens. I don't know how I feel about that, but outside of that, I'm in support of the concept plan as it stands now. I initially had reservations around finding a way of limiting it, this space to Carrboro residents or family members. I want to explore that a little bit more. And I just have a couple of more questions. Can you go back to the slide that has the cost of all of the segmenting of this? All right, so can you explain this to me again? I think I don't like, what is staff proposing? And there, folks, if I understand it, staff is not proposing that we move all with everything forward to like right now. Staff is proposing we adopt this. You would do it to phases, right? Did I get that correct?
That's correct. I think in the interest of time, we would want to phase it, and just capital costs. I mean, you can see the columbarium walls. There's 4 on the plan. They're very expensive. You would not need to purchase all 4 at the outset. But I broke it out this way because that new loop road is really the driving factor in being able to open up additional plots. And so that would be phase 1 and kind of the minimum requirement to begin using that side of the new development.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, Mr. Manager, should we decide to move forward, I imagine I would be in favor of a phase out. What effect would this have on our budget that we're considering for next week?
Because of the cost, it wouldn't be including the FY24 budget. We have to figure out a long-term plan to pay for these improvements.
So even if we approve this tonight, or not, we can't vote on it, but we were to give direction to follow, to look into this, we're still looking at a pretty, I don't know, a timeline, but it wouldn't happen immediately, right?
No, we'd have to work toward it. Maybe FY '25, probably the first year we really get to it, to really make some progress in terms of getting these phases into place.
Gotcha, thank you. That was, okay. And I imagine that there's been no conversation or kind of looked into what a fence or something would cost, right?
Right, we haven't priced it for this cemetery. I hate to put Ben on the spot, but do you recall what old Carrboro, what that?
We recently put in a 6-foot fence in Old Carrboro Cemetery. That cost $30,000. That was around the entire perimeter. I don't recall the amount of feet. It was maybe 1,000 feet. And that was a black chain link fence, commercial grade.
We did look into, I think, a wrought iron fence at one point, and that's very expensive to do that type, that style fencing.
No, because I'm looking, and part of the reason that I asked, right, is knowing that even if we approve this, it's not going to happen tomorrow. There's going to be some time that it's going to take for this to happen. I'm very interested. Originally, I wasn't, but now I'm very interested in some kind of barrier that would cement the sacredness of this space. And again, I go back. I've spent some time thinking about this, and as already mentioned by some of my colleagues, it's just unfathomable to me that we have dogs and that we have actions inconsistent with not just our ordinance but what cemetery deserves. So I would really be interested in if we could explore some kind of fencing or barrier that could be implemented while this process is going on, even if it's not the most beautiful thing. And I don't know what that would look like. I just want to make sure that as we are moving forward with this, if we move forward with this project, which I hope the council will give that direction to move forward with this, we are making it absolutely clear to the community, to folks who have their family members buried there, those folks who are going to be using this green space as well, of what isn't acceptable to be done at a cemetery based on our ordinance, and have something, some kind of fence, some kind of barrier that not only lets folks, has the information there, but is just one other step to maintain the sacredness of the space. I also wanted to kind of look at land outside of Carrboro. Right? We've been asked to consider to buy land and turn that into a cemetery. At the moment in time, I'm not in favor of that. I think we have a space now that is dedicated as a cemetery. We have the opportunity to expand this, and if future councils decide that they want to explore buying more land outside of Carrboro for a cemetery, I'll leave it up to them, but I would not be in favor of moving forward with buying land for a cemetery purpose outside of Carrboro or within Carrboro outside of this lot. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thanks, Eleazar. All right, Danny?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate a lot of what's been said tonight. And I think, at the baseline, this concept plan gets us pretty close. A lot of people listening and on the council know that I did sort of, largely for a lot of the points that Sammy was making, I initially was pretty persuaded that we ought to be prioritizing community green space and use for that purpose in this space. Over the course of public discussion, I have become persuaded that they're just not super compatible uses to the fully programmed extent of a park. I think, we kind of weighing the possibility of using this particular land for a park, we're kind of weighing a couple different questions, which are, on the one hand, that it is not a park. It is currently the unused land of a cemetery, and, what has led us to the de facto community use of it as a green space is a lack of enforcement. And so then on the other hand, we have these other policies that prioritize access to parks, which in some sense we would not be, sort of enforcing or acting upon by not prioritizing. So all to say, if I'm forced to weigh those conclusions, I think what is presently there is not compatible with a park for me at the end of the day. Hearing from community is persuasive on that point. I do, there are a lot of cemeteries in this world that I have appreciated as green space, including where my dad is in Oakwood in Raleigh, which is really a pretty widely trafficked community resource and a very beautiful space. And so what kind of has emerged here for me is to, I think for sort of both sides of this issue to be reductive, is to make the space as enjoyable and sort of edifying to be in as possible, period, as a cemetery. And so to that end, I really like a fence. I think a fence is important. It sounds expensive. And so I think that that's something to think about pretty carefully in terms of phasing. I mean, I would really love to go as far as what Randy is describing. I wonder too, I didn't see, I might be wrong, Ben, but the replacement of the Bradford pears, I know that we've talked about that a lot as sort of being consistent with town goals all over the place, but that money is not actually reflected in these estimates, is that right?
So the council did direct staff to make those and other improvements to the cemeteries, but they have not yet been put in the budget.
Okay. So, I mean, I think, sort of first things first, to me, phase one here, in addition to the roads, I think like a fence is something to think about very quickly, in terms of, because I don't think we can enforce this ordinance, honestly, with any reasonable standard. I mean, we have some number of openings right now in our police department. Every time we move to enforce a relatively, as compared to emergencies, a relatively low stakes situation, it's depleting their resources. So I think a fence solves that, to be direct. I would really like to see it prioritized. $30,000 is a pretty high floor, and I'd like to see more than chain link. So, I don't know. Wishes were fishes, I guess. And I also think, in addition to the Bradford pears, that I actually have spent quite a bit of time in the cemetery, sort of meditating. At the beginning of the pandemic, I would come and I would sit on the construction hill to get away from the sound of my screeching children. And it's one of the most sun-baked places on earth. Including where there are, and I think one of the things that makes old Carrboro so appealing is that there are trees throughout the entire cemetery. And so I wonder, just to the extent to which it's possible in this open space, if we can't plant some trees and provide some shade. That's some of what I'm hearing from community is shade. And I love these walking trails through the southern portions, but outside of that, we're not really doing a lot of shade. So I would say a fence, shade. And then I do think it's worth considering that closing this question in either end, I think Sammy is wise to counsel us that we are we're thinking about millions of dollars either way, sort of within our town's plans to take care of our park priorities. I think I appreciate Trish showing that map. I think some of the southern parts of town, there are places that I think we can all imagine sort of around University Lake where maybe it's possible to acquire that, but I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars. And I think I'm not necessarily personally opposed to being in the cemetery business later. I think it's instructive that these are revenue generating at net, not necessarily all at once. Land is very expensive and we're talking about expensive improvements, but I was pleasantly surprised by the manager's estimates that these add revenue over the course of their lives. I can hear both arguments very reasonably there personally. I don't, somebody's got to do it is a dangerous frame of mind, but I like about Carrboro that we're doing this. The more that we've gotten into this issue, that's actually what first kind of moved me away from considering this as a park, is just considering how little access there really is for public burials. I think it's pretty cool that we do that. So I wouldn't want to necessarily close that question, but I think, in order, it raises pretty urgent questions about like a large-scale facility in the southern part of town for parks. And it does make us understand, $68,000 an acre at median in 10 years is going to be higher. So, okay, I just kind of want to get that all on the record for the purpose of the work session. I think my most pointed feedback here is great, fence, shade. And also, I'm good with open space and perpetuity. I think that suits the sort of purposes that we're trying to meet here.
Great, thanks, Danny. I don't have a whole lot to add because I feel like council members have really covered the key points, and I feel like we're on a similar wavelengths here for the most part, in terms of recognizing a need to use or remain a portion of the property for additional burial space, potentially for some of these other uses like columbarium and so on, while also recognizing the opportunity for some open green space on the property. And I think that the staff has done a really nice job of hearing these interests, as we have from all the community members who have participated in this conversation, and showing us something that seems like a really good starting place, and probably more than just a starting place, but really a direction to go in. I agree with council members about the importance of separating or buffering the uses from each other just for some mutual respect out of the uses of the property. I think that's really important, and so I appreciate that so many of you, all of you, really have spoken to that importance of the fact that this is and will remain a cemetery, and we need to make sure that that's respected. What that looks like, I don't know. I don't feel like I want to sit here and try to design that right now, whether it's a fence or a wall or a whatever, or a vegetative buffer, or whatever it is. I just agree that it's important to build that kind of respectful separation into the design. And then in terms of the open space or green space itself, I also agree that having a sort of fully programmed park does not make sense on this location. I do like the idea, though, of, and this is what many of the neighbors who spend time in that space appreciate about it, I think, is what I gather, is that it is an open space, that it's green space. I don't know that I think that having a playground, for example, or some of these other more active recreation uses that you see in more formalized park settings would be appropriate for Westwood Cemetery. But green open space for passive recreation makes a lot of sense to me. So that's my thought about just the concept we've been shown. And I guess I would like for us to be able to express to the manager that there's some consensus around some of these key points around the concept plan itself, so that we can just say, this is what we like, move on, move forward. There are some of these other questions we've talked about around, and I'll also say I agree with kind of the idea that this is not going to be an immediate build out of anything, right? We're talking about something that would need to be phased, it would need to be programmed in the capital, in our budget. And so just knowing that the manager has that in mind as well is important. So some of these other questions that we've talked about tonight around, does the town continue to operate cemeteries beyond Westwood? I go back and forth on that question, and I have to say I'm not sure I see the argument either way. And so I don't have a strong feeling about it. But I do feel like this is an opportunity for us on this site, which is what we're here to talk about primarily in my mind, to expand opportunities for additional in-ground and green burials, and perhaps some of these other uses. To those, to me, it seemed like the priority. Retain the open green space and designate it as such, so that it's clear to future councils that the intention here in this conversation is to retain that space as an open green space and not for burials and so on. And then to make sure that the uses are buffered from each other in a respectful way. So those are my priorities. The other questions to me, I feel like, are things I don't have super strong feelings about, and that I could probably have a longer conversation about at another time. But if we were to move out of this conversation with some consensus around a concept plan and those values that I just listed, I would be really pleased. So any additional thoughts about that? I've heard some people, and maybe Sammy, you could speak to this too, when you see the concept plan, is that something you feel like is a good starting point? Is it something to work with?
Thanks for the question. Again, I think given that there's still open, this question, it seems like from at least a couple of other council members on the question of taking advantage of cheaper land outside for if we continue being in the business of cemeteries. I would be more for scaling down what was presented tonight. In other words, along the lines of what you were describing, green burials, retaining the green space, keeping those two separate, and traditional burials, but maybe not the columbariums and the scattered ash and the other ones. That is more in line with what I conceive of as a way to buy us some more time. I do have a question for the manager. The estimate of current spaces in the cemetery is 18 months, which if we're thinking about next budget cycle, when we would allocate the funds for this, would put us 6 months before we run out. So I just, for the community, like maybe Susan's point of like, there are columbariums in Chapel Hill, there might be a gap where we will run out of space because we won't have been able to open more space. So just so we're all aware of that, which is, again, I'm underscoring the reason why we're trying to buy more time in previous council meeting through other measures of like keeping this space just for Carrboro people, in light of the fact that our partners, our neighboring jurisdictions, Chapel Hill and Hillsborough, I believe Hillsborough too, and the county aren't in the business of cemeteries. So we're left holding the bag of using millions of dollars worth of space for serving county needs. And I think that is a very important thing that we need to be accountable to our community about too, and transparent. You know, if that's what we decide to do, then let it be known. So yeah, those are my responses to your question. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sammy. I appreciate the comment. So I think it sounds like we've heard of at least maybe all of us say that priority in terms of the continued cemetery use of the property for more burial space, priorities are traditional in-ground burials and green burials.
Yeah.
If there are other uses beyond that, for example, possibility of building a columbarium or four or whatever down the road, that may be an option. But I want the manager to go away from this conversation with a sense of where the priorities are for us. Barbara, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. The prioritization or limiting to Carrboro residents, I do understand the intent, but also the extra layer of admin that could present for our staff, as well as a burden to families that are coming in at already a very difficult time. So just to take that into account as we continue to kind of talk about that. And whether to stay in the cemetery business or not, I think that's a future discussion for another board at another time if this council decides to go ahead with the concept plan that is in front of us. I don't know how much we need to, to really cue in on that. We can't see into the future and know, what's going to happen. I do know, I know Chapel Hill and Hillsborough are not in the cemetery business anymore, particularly Chapel Hill. They ran out of space and determined that, they didn't want to be in the cemetery business anymore, but certainly that's not where we are, because we have a whole back portion that we have access to and will share with community, with a portion of that being reserved for open space. And the columbariums, if I remember correctly from the slide, that was the most expensive item on there. It was at $600,000, and I believe that was for 4. And so I'm not wedded to that at all. It's pretty expensive. It's a big footprint, and so I can take that or leave it because cremains can also be interred. They don't have to be put into the columbarium. So that's a very expensive item. And so I could easily kind of probably scratch that off the list with no problem. Thank you.
Great. I have Danny next and then Susan.
So this is a question for Ben. I think in the last time we talked about this in the meeting, pretty much as soon as we designate that we are pursuing further in-ground burials on those sites, those could be sold as future plots,
That's right.
right? That
I
would,
think it's right.
like, even just giving this direction could ease the flow right now and prevent us from heading to the cliff that we're talking about. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I thought it was ready for in-ground.
So we would want to, I mean, this is a concept plan, so it would need to be taken a step further. And then you could, have all of these plotted out.
And what's that step and how long?
That would be re-engaging with either this consultant or another one, and I think partly it would depend on where this ultimately ends up as a final design. I think you'd want to take it to that step before you finalize plot locations. So that would be an engineering or landscape architect.
Was that like a 6 months or a year? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on, again, the loop road was the main driving factor of this design. If that was agreed on, that would be basically the starting point for the rest of the development, and so that would be a pretty short process.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, Danny.
Oh, all good. That's pretty much what I'm looking for. I mean, I guess that would be important to just kind of keep in mind. Order of operations would be like, I think one of the main things with slowing down sales was just, in addition to the admin stuff, the equity issues that it prevents with sort of like who's in there, who gets to be in there, whose relationship matters where in terms of, I mean, all of that is very thorny and I think is very difficult when we consider how important the space is to the people who are already in there. That bond is very real to that land. So all to say, just really trying to avoid getting into a situation where we prioritize, knowing that we are opening up these spaces. So I don't know if there is a way to sort of expedite sales of future plots, or maybe to, if we are contacted about that, to sort of have just an administrative process of waiting on future plots. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, I think Sammy's making a point that we should really hear practically. And that seems like a potential avenue to do that.
And I'll come to Susan in 1 second, just a follow-up question, Ben, because you've mentioned how the loop road is an important determining factor here for what else happens. If there's interest on the council, or if there's less interest on the council in, for example, pursuing the columbarium walls, right? Does that change the potential footprint here, especially regarding the loop road?
It could, yeah.
So, I mean, in other words, somewhat smaller footprint.
Yeah.
That could then become part of that open space, designation.
I mean, the loop road, the main function is a place for people to turn around.
Right.
And you can see the existing cul-de-sac is covered up by features of the plan.
Right.
So it could be redesigned, be taken out completely along with the cul-de-sac.
Okay, so just wanted to raise that as a possibility. And Randy, I do see your hand, but I'm going to go to Susan next. She's ahead of you, and then I'll come to you, Randy.
Yes, just a few quick items. I wanted to go back. Barbara, I appreciate your comments about trying to sort of have a process in place to restrict who has access to the burial plots. It is sort of this question. Sammy, actually, I think the number is even 13 months out. We run out of burial plots, and then even the new plots take us out maybe 10 years. But the point is, do we want, we've heard from a lot of community members and realized the importance the cemetery has to a lot of Carrboro residents and their family members. So the question is, I would have for staff is just how complicated would it be to look at things like, are you a Carrboro resident? Are you a relative of somebody who is buried at the cemetery? Are you a relative of a Carrboro resident? Just some kind of simple things to be asking, and wouldn't want it to be overly burdensome at all. but we would be prioritizing some Carrboro residents at a time that we are, we're going to be running out of these aerial plots one day. So I wanted to just lift that up. I really do agree about the columbariums. The price tag is, I think, about $600,000, so $150,000 each. It made me gulp. So for right now, maybe that is something we delay and come back to later. I also really appreciate all of the concerns that have been expressed about respecting the sanctity of the space, and so the fence will certainly help. I also wanted to ask, with the savings from the columbariums, perhaps putting up a few more signs if there were a fence maybe at the gates, I'm not sure, but just to create a little bit more awareness as folks do enter the space of what the expectations will be. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, one of the things that has left the biggest impression on me is learning more about the history of Westwood. A cemetery that opened in 1948, and Black residents were not allowed to be buried there until 1968. And then just the history of some other Black cemeteries around the country that were unearthed, that were abandoned, that were not well kept up. But it does make me wonder, as the liaison to the Truth Plaque Task Force, is this an opportunity to have a plaque there recognizing the history of Westwood? And so I will throw that out. I'll make that recommendation to our task force, but maybe it would be something that we would want to consider down the road, because I think that story does need to be shared. So,
thank you, Susan. Randy?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Susan, I'm really glad you finished with the comments about the plaque. Susan and I were talking today, and I mentioned to her that one of the things that I had envisioned in the open space is that the open space have a plaque that tells the history, so folks would understand when they're in that open space why it's such a special open space. Likewise, it certainly could be in the near the gate when people are entering the cemetery. I would spend money on the wrought iron, and I'm going to tell you why. Chain link fence in the old Carrboro Cemetery is not sitting in the middle of a space that has hundreds of people looking into this huge field of headstones the way Westwood does. We need to make Westwood look stately, and whatever the cost we put in now will yield itself in the sense of repose that the atmosphere will give. If you put up a chain link fence, even though it could be a black chain link fence, it doesn't have the stateliness that a more expensive fence. It would only look like it's utilitarian. I want to get away from that. I want to bring the solemn dignity to that space, because it's been right next to the sidewalk and the crossroads of two streets, forever. So I'm just going to underscore that point. I did want to point out where the columbarium is, and Ben, if you would show the concept plan, and I guess you can figure out already, I'm not a fan of the consultant's plan, because I see it as just a development plan. The area where the columbarium is and that loop road, Ben, isn't that the exact area with the tight topo boundaries?
Yeah, that's where some shallow rock is, and along here
Right.
too.
So if that area were left as part of the open space, and the area that is viable for in-ground internments were I guess it forms like a little J shape around it, maybe. Is that right? And it leaves a good tree line between the cemetery and the Glosson neighbors. Is that correct? Am I interpreting that correctly?
That's right.
Yes.
Okay, so it is possible that the turnaround could be just on the far side of where that loop is, if that loop area became open space because it's topologically bedrock and challenging, and that the expanded cemetery for internments be set, adjacent to that. I think you had pointed that out. And I think that is one way to, to use that space and dedicate that space. And as I said, I think it's, it would work for not only community, but it also adds to the overall sense of the entire site being one that is restorative in terms of just spiritual, connections. And I say that because that's one of the things I pulled from everyone. Now, I understand Sammy's interest in the park. I think that that's probably a stretch, but I think the open space is something we can get consistent agreement on. The only other point I was going to make is I think the cost is very compelling about certainly not looking at the columbarium. What I would want to know, and Eleazar, you brought up the question of a timeline. If we could get the information on the kinds of fencing or the kind of sound wall material and vegetative, tree canopy information, if we could get that and get an idea of what does that look like in regard to costs over time. I mean, because, trees and fencing could be done early. And I think it was said that, the potential grave sites could also be marketable rather soon. I think there is only about 14 months based on the 78 plots that are left. So, keeping that in mind, there may be a way to move forward and phase in the sale of potential new plots. But also bringing to us, if the manager and staff, can do that, is, a plan that would show us a really modified concept plan that takes out that loop and the columbarium where the topography is not conducive, and makes that part of the open space and separates that from the rest of the cemetery. That would be my ask.
Thank you, Randy. So I want to start moving us toward a wrapping up here, but I have Eleazar next and then come back to Sammy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to, and just real quick, and Councilmember Haven O'Donnell kind of hit on this a little bit. Should we, and the way that I'm reading this map, if you want to put it back up, if we take out that loop with the columbariums, which I'm also kind of not tied to the columbariums or the garden, they could stay or go. I'm not married to either of those two. If we were to take that loop out, about half of that space would still be, would that, if I'm understanding correctly, would be a within the parameters, we would need to expand burials plots or no?
So you mean for B1?
Yeah,
So
no,
those
no,
are-
like if we were to cut, if we don't have that circle, right? So then that means we don't have B1, or we would have that like cut in half. But I'm thinking of where is that A4 hits the line, or at the very top. Would that just, could we extend that all the way down to hit the road?
I think that's because it's too shallow. That's where it's too shallow to do that.
Gotcha. All right. Because I'm kind of thinking of how do we expand, or we have more of these plots without cutting into that green space that we want to leave open, just knowing of how much the timeline and so on. So, okay. And then just question around, we would still need to, even if I believe we're moving forward with keeping this as a cemetery, we would still need to get some professionals to come in here and really take this concept plan and our input and formulate some kind of something that comes back to council. I know that we don't have the funding in the 24 budget to move forward with any of these to move forward with any with the cemetery or anything that we approve tonight. But do we have in the budget, or is there a way that we can get in the budget? And I know that we have the budget next week, so I'm trying not to put a huge strain on that. But would there be some kind of funding to go ahead and acquire those services, so that when we come back next year, knowing that we don't have the funding now to make any of these improvements or make any of these kind of make this possible, I don't want to find ourselves in a spot that we come back next year and say, yes, all right, we're going to move forward with this. We have the funding to move forward with it now, but we still have to wait, number of months to hire the consultant, get the plan, come back to council. I imagine we're going to have just the way that council works. It's not going to be something that we're going to look at in one day and come back. It's going to take some time for all that process to happen. And I don't want to find ourselves in a space where we have the space, we have the willingness of the council to move forward with burials, but we just, because of time constraints, we don't have any available for community. Right. So I guess my question is, Mr. Manager, is there a way to kind of get that first part out of the way in this upcoming year?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we need to get going. I think time is of the essence here. And so that's what I would ask council. Two things. One, if you would give us some sense of, in this concept, someplace to start. And I think we've got that tonight.
Yeah.
I guess my only question is about the columbarium. One thing we talked about as staff is, with some availability of columbariums, would take some pressure off the burial sites, that folks could use that as opposed to one of the burial sites.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some other redesign of that columbarium, and maybe it's a smaller version of it someplace else. I just want to toss that out. Okay. Yes, we can get some agreement on the conceptual plan, and we'll try to figure out some funding to at least get this started in terms of design, to get us to move forward to the next step for implementation.
Okay. So I'll try to work on us getting there, and I had Sammy coming up next, but I can go back to you, Susan.
Yeah, Ben, I was just wondering about that.
But Sammy, hold on. Let me just make sure LESR was done.
I just answer, at least to enumerate where I'm at. I am in agreement. Let's find a way to have as many traditional plots as possible. I'm full in agreement with the green burials, and a big priority for me sooner rather than later is having some kind of barrier around the cemetery as well. I like the idea of having some columbariums. I'm not married to it. I'm not really. I don't think as a council we're looking at this at the garden. So I think that would be out. But yeah, I just wanted to say where I'm at with that. But definitely top priority for me is getting something going, and if we can put some kind of barrier sooner rather than later.
Okay, great. Thanks, LESR. Sammy?
I was just curious about that area above F1, Ben. Why is that empty?
That was just maintaining green space. The previous concept had more of the in-ground cremains there at 2 foot depth.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would support a green burial or traditional burial.
Oh, okay.
But it could be used for in-ground cremains,
could be used
perhaps,
for
as another option, again, to relieve pressure on demand for other uses.
Yeah, or even columbariums. right?
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping we could drop A4 down to that space and save more open space, but it sounds like that's close to the rock. Can you show us the picture of the rock? Okay.
So
Oh, yeah, so it's that little area.
The loop road comes approximately through here. So right there, you're in the
It's too shallow.
-4, yeah.
Okay, oh, yeah, it gets shallower the further away. I see. That's how it works. Okay, never mind. That was my interest. I guess just to underscore, yeah, I'm supportive of seeing designs, but if we could have a couple of options to consider, because what I'm hearing here is there's an agreement on separation and fencing, one, to create dignity around the cemetery, but the other to create a separation between the open space and what might happen there in the cemetery itself. And maybe there's unanimous agreement, but if we could have a couple of options, for example, what kind of fencing that would be, so that the council can make a decision on that.
You're saying it in this area?
That basically, like Randy was originally describing when she remotely requested you're moving the cursor, coming down and then cutting an L across, creating a separation between the open space and the cemetery, in essence. And she was talking about a sound barrier and having vegetation in front of it. So I think having options in terms of what that kind of fencing is, so that when we have a regular meeting, we'll have an opportunity to have feedback from the community itself, not just us conversing in this work session. But along with that, maybe one or two options in terms of how, like taking out that roundabout and kind of like what the area that we're talking about is. And maybe it is just A4 and then bumping down some of the columbariums into that open space there. Yeah, I don't know. If there's more than one option to imagine that, then to share it with us.
And I do think part of the intent of this was to show all the options, all of the
Right.
anything you could put in cemetery.
So we're narrowing down to it. Thanks. Oh, one last question. In the wooded area, there used to be, is that where the green burial would happen?
I think F1 is where.
Yeah, F1 is where it's plotted here. The previous concept also had an F2 space here.
So, I mean, given that that's already kind of separated from the open space, I wouldn't be averse to, as an option, to consider that as, what is it called, a full burial?
Additional burial space.
Like, it's not the.
Traditional.
No, not traditional. What's the other one? The
Green burial.
Green burial. Like, it's in the woods, right? That's where you
Yeah.
do green burial.
Right.
Because it was going to be kept wooded for green burial, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so I think that's still, that, because we're already talking about that quadrant, that section to be cemetery.
Yeah. Thanks, Sammy. Susan.
Final word, very fast. First, Ben, I want to thank you for this. You really did a terrific job with this concept plan and helping us take these last 2 hours, and I think we all are feeling like we have a lot of clarity in terms of moving forward, and that feels really good, so thank you for that. And also, Damon, I just wanted to check, we had talked a little bit about council's intention that the open space remains open space for generations to come. That can be overturned by a future council, but I wanted to make sure everybody was feeling okay about that, because maybe if not everybody does. I didn't want to just sort of assume everybody
I have
was
that on
okay
the
with
list
that.
of kind of summary points to make.
Okay.
But sure, thank you for highlighting that in particular, because I want to make sure that this has been good back and forth here about honing in on what we care about, right, in terms of what happens on the site. And the things that I'm hearing loud and clear are separation or buffering between the open space and the burial areas. And what that looks like is kind of, could be fence, could be wall, could be vegetative, could be some combination. I think that's for staff to kind of figure out some options. Second is a priority on the in-ground traditional burials and green burial spaces. And we've talked a little bit about reconfiguring some of that potentially based on what staff has heard from our input tonight. an interest in a smaller footprint, achieving a smaller footprint by not building out that full central option, but instead possibly moving some of that down, like a columbarium or two, and not having that full road build out, which would then allow some additional open space. And then as Susan highlighted there at the end, finding a way for staff to enable us to designate that open space as open space for foreseeable future, right? That the intention is that is to be used as an open green space and separated from the other uses on the cemetery property. So I guess let me ask before I come back to council, Richard, is that the kind of clarity you need to have a sense of the direction we want to go in?
Yes, I believe I have enough here. We can move forward.
Okay. Does that fairly summarize what I've heard from council members tonight? Okay, so feeling good about that? Okay.
We're done.
What else?
We don't have nothing else, right?
Richard, you have what you need in terms of the budget?
That's what I was going to add. It seems like we need to bring back in this conversation next week of the budget, some way to finance the design, to revisit this conceptual plan, to get that moving. So we'll try to figure it out and have that for you for discussion next Tuesday at the budget discussion.
Okay. Any other questions? Everybody good? I want to thank the community members also and staff who were able to come out and join us tonight being such a big part of helping us get to this point and come to some decisions. And I guess we will
Motion to adjourn.
make a motion
Second.
to adjourn. Moved by Sammy, seconded by Eleazar, that we adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. We are adjourned.
Did you really?